Okay, hello guys. Matt Rowe here with Kev for the Swift Power Up Cycling Podcast. This is episode 29, and it's the Marginal Gains Part 2 with Josh Poertner. So yeah, how are you, Kev? What's going on?
Yeah, good, thanks, Matt. In Australia, getting ready to head to California soon, but I'm looking forward to the second part of this podcast because I have to admit, I've been taking a lot of notes and I've got a lot of questions for Josh as well. So looking forward to what he has to say in this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get stuck into it. Here we go. All right. Briefly mentioned, the track and where weight is not really the factor there, and how measurable the track as a discipline is. The hour record. I think that's a good topic to speak about, and that's obviously been broken recently by Victor Campanaerts. Just over 55 kilometers an hour, which if you try and ride at 55k an hour, I think most of us won't manage it for that long. So it's incredible how fast these guys are going. And just bringing it back to the fact that some of these marginal gains are limited by the UCI. So position-wise, and this relates to the hour record, you can't really explore too extreme body positions on the bike. So like the Superman position that Graham O'Brien pioneered back in the day, and then Chris Boardman used to set the hour record. I think it was 1996. He actually done 56 kilometers an hour. So back in, over 20 years ago, Boardman went quicker than Victor Campanaerts set the hour record just the other week. That is crazy fast. I guess that shows two things. One, how strong Boardman was, but also how fast that position was. But obviously were restricted by that the UCI. But just to explore some of the finer details that are now considered by Victor Campanaerts in his hour record attempt. He had custom helmet. So Victor's head went through a 3D scanner to come up with a perfect shape and size helmet for the hour record.
Yeah, no, his preparation was really fun to watch, and it's honestly, we've been involved in quite a few of these, and this was one that we were not directly involved with. So it's fun. It's actually fun to be able. I can probably talk more about it than most of the others, having not been on the inside. But yeah, they really did almost everything. I think I would love to see personally the data on. He's on a bike that I wouldn't say was one of the fastest bikes, but clearly was that because of sponsorship. I think, the helmet that he was riding would not generally be one of the fastest helmets, but in a custom form for, his laser scanned head potentially got them there.
Mm-hmm. Just on the helmet there, what's he trying to do? He's trying to make that helmet as tight and as small as possible, basically, to punch a smaller hole as possible through the air. Is that the aim?
Yes. So you'll hear a lot in these conversations, just like we talk about rolling resistance, we talk about the CRR, right? The coefficient of rolling resistance. Mm-hmm. In aero, we use a thing called CDA, and that's the coefficient of drag times the frontal area. And so CDA is kind of a good number that you can plug into the math, and, engineers have a real obsession with these unitless numbers, these coefficients, because they work across unit systems. They work across, different forms of the equations. It really makes for some beautiful math. But so, you think of the CD in CDA is the drag coefficient, and that's related to essentially the pressure drag around the object, right? So you can have something, you can have a wing that's, 10 centimeters chord length, and you can have one that's 10 meters chord length of the same shape, and they'll have the same CD. Mm-hmm. So that's regardless of units. And then the A is the area. And so what he's doing is trying to reduce the A. He's making his frontal area smaller with using some of the same shapes. And yeah, and it makes a ton of sense. I mean, we saw back in the kind of the old, the 2000s, the Lance Armstrong era with the kind of the vacuum formed plastic shell helmets, that really kind of go all the way back to the 80s. It's not a protective helmet. Mm-hmm. It's just bigger than your head. And you could get these ridiculous, beautiful aerodynamic shapes with these incredibly low areas. And of course, now that we have to ride helmets with actual safety properties, the helmets are much bigger, yes. Right? So even for the same CD, you might have, the number goes up 10% or 20% because of the A. So yeah, they really work to refine a lot of stuff, the custom handlebars he used, not a new technology. Sky's been doing that now for, I think, 5 or 6 years. Bradley used it in his hour record, printed titanium cockpit, that you can really get more aero shapes than you can get more aero shapes with perfect positioning through like a one-piece printed bar than you're going to get through a modular bar, right? You have less because there's no, you don't have to have space for the hardware, the bolts, the screws, all the little bits. Yeah. You just print the thing as clean as possible. I have to say, I loved in our Secret Squirrel Society, it was really excited to see that he shaved his head. Yes. This has been a topic for a long time because there's sort of a dual benefit to the shaved head, right? Or it's almost a triple benefit. One, you can get a smaller helmet on your shaved head than your hairy head, and so that's a very real thing for these events. Two, if you're running any ventilation in the helmet, that air is going to move through more cleanly than if it has to go through hair, and so you generally need some ventilation there for physiological reasons, right? To prevent overheating. And then three, not having the hair there goes a long way in helping to regulate body temperature. One of the challenges with these hour records, right, is that you're pushing the body right up to this limit, this line, and trying to hold it. And of course, over the course of the event, the body temperature is just going up and up and up. If you remember in the Boardman's 96 record, they soaked his clothes in alcohol before he started, just to try to keep him cool for the first, 5 or 7 minutes of the event. Try to create this high level of evaporative cooling around him to try to push back the onset of these high body temperatures. So theoretically, you can perform better in a hot environment with a shaved head than a hairy one. But of course, I think for us, the big one, nobody had really gone all in on that before, because I think that's sort of like the point of no turning back, right? Yeah. If you go so far as to do the head shave and then you don't get it, that's just such a risk, right? And so when he showed up and shaved the head, it was like, this is going to be exciting. He is the level of commitment is so high. Yeah. But it's in the math too, it's beautiful, the hotter. There's these great trade-offs, right? The hotter the air, the faster you go, right? But then the more physiologically taxing it is, right? The more humid the air, the faster you go, but it's taxing. Same with the altitude, right? He went to altitude, and that was probably worth about 2 kilometers over Wiggins, but you have to acclimate and maintain your level of power output now at a significantly higher altitude, right? So there's all these interesting trade-offs there that are really fascinating.
Yeah, but this is one of the things that Victor Campanaerts he opted for was a short sleeve skin suit and no gloves, and I'm presuming that's down to trying to just touching on the kind of body temperature and regulating your body temperature. That's one of the big issues riders have on Zwift is you're indoors, there's no air circulation, and you just get really hot when you're working really hard. And some clothing manufacturers now are coming out with indoor turbo-specific clothing, shorts and jerseys that are super, super lightweight and super breathable. And I think this is something, obviously Victor Campanaerts in his hour record, he opted for a short sleeve skin suit and no gloves, even though, aero gloves would be more aero. Yeah,
I think it's a great kind of a look into the trade-offs and the hard decisions that these guys have to make, right? For all of these, if you're kind of trying to understand the balance between what's good for the math, right? Hotter is better, humid is better, and what's good for your body, right? Where those are not the better things. It's a fascinating kind of look at that, and I think it's been certainly heartening for me to see the way the clothing manufacturers have embraced the opportunities here, right? Yeah. In the change, and you think of the old days when I was racing, and you had like the latex bodysuit, right? Which was really fast, but just a nightmare, right? It was so hot, so uncomfortable, not in any way good for you. And to see that we have fabrics and designs now that can actually be breathable and faster than those old technologies, but you still have to think that through at a deep level for someone like Campanaerts, right? Is it worth the cooling effect on the arms and the hands? And I do know from a bunch of work that was done actually at Slipstream with Alan Lim a number of years ago when we were working together on how effective your hands are at cooling your body, right? Because it's an extremity, and so you've got all the blood flowing out there,
Yep.
and you can put they have these sort of hand cooling, almost like little machines that you put your hand. It's almost like putting your hand in a bucket of ice water, but not. And you can quickly drop core body temperature by cooling the hands, and so I think it makes a lot of sense for something like the Hour Record, right? That if you can maintain the aero, but actually use that as, almost like a cooling fin for your body. And then similarly, indoor training, right? I think we've all lived through the massive puddle of sweat and what a difference a fan makes.
Absolutely.
Right? A little convective cooling goes a long way, and a lot of convective cooling goes a really long way.
Even two fans. I've gone to two fans now. I've got literally one from each side. So that's my marginal gain is well, why have one fan when you can have two? And I'm sure someone will be having three fans soon.
Right. And you will see in the data. I mean, you will perform
Absolutely.
better, right? You absolutely perform at a higher level when you can keep that temperature under control.
Yeah. Just to, I guess, finish off, Josh, what would you say is the most untapped aspect of cycling in terms of potential for marginal gains in the future? Where are we likely to see big opportunities come up?
Oh gosh, we're probably a year into a really deep dive to try and understand static and dynamic stiffnesses, which is a way of saying, we've spent the last 20 years thinking that we know a lot of stuff that we really probably don't know, or we don't seem to know. And I think, this tire pressure thing is a good example of that, right? I think, we all grew up in a world where, more is better and feel it with your thumb. And that's the answer. And so we found this incredible kind of technological advantage, a marginal gain that is almost not marginal anymore, right? I mean, you look at, some of these tire pressure strategies we develop are, they're worth more than all the ceramic bearings you can possibly buy times 5, right? So, I mean, they're bigger than marginal gains. But one of the areas that really drives me crazy, because I think the industry acts, and we all have acted for so long, like we get stiffness, right? Of course, stiffer's better, right? Of course, it's all about power transfer. And I just, for years now, have not seen it. And we haven't seen it in the data. And I think one of the big telling factors here, right, is you look at like the Martin equation, this big, beautiful physics equation that we can use to determine how fast a rider's going to go on X amount of power. And I think of, like the Wiggins Hour Record, right? Knowing power, being able to play with the math, dropping in the CDA, the CRR, right? Knowing those numbers. I mean, his distance was predicted within like 15 or 20 meters.
Wow.
Right? I mean, the math is so solid. We can predict climbs. I mean, if I take you and I know your equipment, I run you through a wind tunnel sweep, and I know what tires and pressures you're riding on the day, I can predict your outcome within 1%. Right? Provided that the rider puts the power down that is in the model, right? But we can go back after the fact and overlay power files into the data, and we're generally less than 1%. Well, what people don't think is that nowhere in that physics equation for performance is there a stiffness term. It's not in there, right? And so, we've done tests where you take a frame with a bottom bracket stiffness that's a factor of 2 difference, and you have somebody, do a hill climb time trial or these uphill intervals, and you don't see it. And actually, the more we do it, the more it almost begins to look like the higher stiffness is worse. And we've got some interesting theories there as to why, but one of them is that, on incredibly stiff frames, you can hear it in the tires. And one of our theories is that when the bike can't flex in a way, in a mode, it's a directionality that's beneficial for speed, you end up scrubbing that into the tire. And there's certain bikes that have certain levels of stiffness in certain modes that just climb brilliantly, and they may be half the stiffness or less of some of the bikes that supposedly should be doing that. So that's a big, long way of saying, that all this stuff around stiffness is really much less known than I think we like to pretend that it is. And similarly for comfort, we've got bikes with relatively low static stiffness, right? You put it in a test machine and you push on the saddle and go, oh, that's going to be comfortable. And then they ride strangely. And we've got some interesting theories there that really come from car racing and sort of noise, vibration, harshness stuff that the auto industry is doing, where, you can have overly high dynamic stiffness, even in a situation where you have a low static stiffness, due to the way the structure is damped or the way the vibrations travel through it. And that for me is sort of I think the next big untapped area, because we're, as we talked earlier with the impedance of rolling resistance, we've seen that there are certain things we can do, tire pressure being probably the first biggest one, but there are other things we can do to help reduce the impedance or kind of change the slope of that line. And, by the time this is out, we'll have launched a bar tape product that we developed using a really kind of one of these new families of exotic foams that was developed for running shoes, that it's an incredibly low damped foam. So you can actually have a squishier ride in a running shoe that returns more energy than traditional technologies, right? And previously those two things went against each other, right? You wanted more comfort, you ran slower. And these foams have really changed that game. And we've spent the last year plus developing a bar tape that uses this type of foam, with the idea that, the lower the damping, the lower the dynamic stiffness becomes. And that, I think in a lot of cases, a good example of static and dynamic stiffness is, if I take a heavy, crappy tire, right, with a high rolling resistance and a butyl tube in it, and I pump it to the same pressure as a really, thin racing tire with a latex tube in it, they'll have the same static stiffness if we push on them with a test machine, because the air pressure dominates that system, right? But when you ride it on the road, the thicker, heavier tire rides terribly. and one of the reasons it does that is it can't rebound quickly enough to follow the road surfaces. And so a lot of times what you're feeling is sort of the road imperfections smacking into the tire as it's rebounding, rather than the tire actively rebounding against the surface. These are theories we've probably been working on for a couple of years, and honestly, they're full of unknowns.
Yeah,
right. Full of unknowns. So that's what excites me now. I think we're going to find this place where we can start tuning in new ways for comfort that we haven't previously thought about, and in doing so, we are going to find speed in that, because those two are actually working in tandem on this particular topic.
Yeah,
that's exciting for me.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, bar tape, that is an comfort. Maybe it is. The next step is working on your body more. So your physio and maybe flexibility, and focusing, I guess, on enabling your body to operate in these extreme tack positions. Wow, yes, it does open up a lot of possibilities when you put your mind to it. And this, I guess, is the first time I've really thought about trying to think outside the box and listen to what you're saying. There is, it's almost endless where you can take this. But I guess one thing, for our listeners that we can kind of try and quantify and give them some advice. We mentioned it a lot. Tire pressure. I know I think you've got a kind of as a graph on your website, and that you've got a podcast that talks in depth about tire pressure. But for kind of I'm going to call it a normal road, it's kind of a little bit bumpy, but it's not perfect tarmac, but it's not rough. What would be the advice on tire pressure? I guess on a set of 25 mil tires.
Yeah. So the big factors are your weight distribution, the road roughness. The challenge we have now is a 25 millimeter tire on one rim might measure 25 wide and might measure 28 or 29 wide on another rim. And so if you look at the stuff on our website, silca.cc, there's a lot of interesting stuff on there on what the actual measurements are and how you need to be using the measured number, not the sidewall printed number. The way I recommend it, and we've been working for a while now on an algorithm that people can plug in, kind of their situation and get a number. And of course, it's so hard because of the road roughness is, how do we define that, right? One of the unthought of things is, even brand new tarmac has a lot of negative space in it. So it might look perfectly smooth, but those negative spaces force the tire to work and to kind of squirm around to create the contact patch in very similar ways to what positive roughness does to the tire. And so that's one of the challenges we have. And it's quite honestly why, teams still have us come out to events through the year and really do the science on this. But what I generally tell people is that, chances are incredibly good that you are running too much pressure, because most of us are or were. If you haven't taken a deep dive and thought this through, you're almost guaranteed to be running too much pressure. And so the way I like to describe it is humans, we're not good at perceiving speed. I talk a lot, I think there's a thing on our website about it, but there's a talk I do on this. And I say, if you've ever gone, on the highway in like a Jeep Wrangler, right? Or an old Land Rover Defender, you go 150K an hour in one of those things on the highway and you feel like you're going to die. You go 150K an hour in a big S-Class Mercedes and they've got that thing that vibrates the steering wheel so the driver doesn't fall asleep, right? The reality is that they're the same speed, right? It's just in the Jeep, it feels so fast because, vibration and wind noise are proxies for speed. Right. So we don't perceive speed well. So we use proxies. Well, we've had that same problem on the bikes, right? High tire pressure feels fast because it puts all this high frequency vibration into the system and your brain perceives that as speed. Same thing with wind noise. I actually worked on a helmet project back in the Lance Armstrong days where, we found we actually cut a little piece of the helmet out so that the riders could get some wind noise on their ears, because when they didn't hear it, they would go too hard, right? They would say, go at this power, and they would go over power because they don't feel like they're going fast because they don't hear the wind, right? I mean, it's kind of a fascinating thing, but you have to train your body to perceive actual speed, not the proxy of speed. So back to this one, I always tell people, what you think is fast probably isn't. So take what you think is fast, drop it 5 PSI, drop it 5 PSI again, and really focus on trying to feel for smooth. Because you will feel as the ride will start to smooth out a little bit. And then if you keep going, you will hit a point where all of a sudden the front cornering starts to feel kind of squishy, right? Kind of vague and weird. Stop there and go back up 5. And you're going to be really pretty close to an optimal at that point. And I think, people are surprised we get tons of email into the podcast and to the website on this of, it just doesn't feel fast. I just can't believe it. Well, look at, if you have a power meter, look at the data. I promise you, you're not going slower. And, the people who do have power meters and who do, use Strava or Golden Cheetah or, one of a way that you can actually get in and really kind of break that apart, you will find that if anything, you're going faster and feeling slower. And the key at that point is to just, continue doing it until you can kind of reset your brain.
Got you.
I give it, 2 weeks, right? Just keep telling yourself it's not slower. It just feels different. That's the advice that we give to the Pro Tour athletes as well, right? Seek smoothness over vibration.
So I'm 80 kilos and I would ride, say 85 PSI. You telling me try lower?
That's, dude, you're tall as well.
Yeah, I'm 6'5",
80 kilos. And so you're probably not far off. I mean, you on a 25 that measures 25, you're probably about right. On a 25 that measures like a 28, you're probably drop it 5 and see what you think. Yeah, that's, weight distribution's another one. There's some charts on the internet that talk about, like a 60-40 weight balance. And I think one thing to remember is that that's only true when you're on the tops or if you have a pretty rearward saddle position. But when you really need that front tire pressure is when you're descending and in the drops. And you can actually go 50-50, if not actually slightly forward weight biased on serious downhill. So, we tend to go a couple of PSI, a couple of percent lower in the front. And then on certain mountain stages of the tour, we might actually go equal front rear pressure because you just really need the cornering, of the front tire on those steep downhills. But yeah, I'd say for you, your 80s probably not going to be a bad place. And I think 75 is probably also good. And then on a 25 at your weight, you start to risk pinch flats
at 70
towards the optimal, right? And so, that's where like a 26, 27, 28 would probably allow you to have a slightly higher rolling efficiency, kind of get a little bit more into that sweet spot of rolling efficiency without, bringing up the pinch flat risk.
Sure. That's good. And again, it's only a couple of years ago that I would just be, on a training ride, I'd be pumping 105, 110 in, and to race, I'd be going harder for sure. And it's only the last couple of years as it's become a lot more mainstream, I guess, the education around it. If I drop to these regions, so good to hear. I'm not a million miles away anyway. Josh, absolute pleasure chatting to you. Really thought provoking. I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners are going to take a bunch of stuff away. And if this is some of the really techie stuff that Josh has mentioned, if that's your thing, the Marginal Gains podcast, this is what Josh runs. He's got the website, marginalgainspodcast.cc. Don't stop listening to the Zwift podcast, but just listen to the Marginal Gains one as well. Fantastic podcast. So Josh, thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
There we go. So what do you make of that lot then, Kev?
Well, first thing I'm going to do is go and shape my head and get a smaller helmet. It's just incredible, the knowledge, the insight that he has for aerodynamics and rolling resistance and just the whole package. I think we said in the last podcast, this certainly is Formula One level attention to detail, and this is what cycling needs. And I certainly know that all teams aren't doing this, but for the general rider, we can all take away a few points from his podcasts and put them into practice ourselves. So it really is interesting stuff.
And again, you hear me mention about my suggestion of hollowing out a chainring, maybe a little extreme, but that's kind of where your mind heads. Chatting with Josh, it's kind of your mind just goes racing. What about this? What about that? So if any of you listeners, let us know on the forum, the Zwift forum, about your thoughts. If you have any ideas for marginal gains, you may want to paint them first before someone steals them. But yeah, on a serious note, any ideas you got, just share them. Be good to hear what you're thinking. Zwift session review then, Kev. This is in the 60 to 90 minutes to burn, so a nice, good, long, solid workout. We're talking TT2 core workout. So this is 13 times 3-minute blocks of 40 seconds zone 4 with 20 second spikes in zone 5.
Yeah, this is a big session. This is the classic 40-20s. It's been around for a while and it is super effective training. 13 3-minute blocks, so there's a lot of work there. But I guess for me, the key point here is that with 40-20s, they're really suitable to a certain type of rider. I guess getting into the science part of it now, if you are a real fast twitch type of rider, then you're going to respond to 40-20s. If you are a slow twitch diesel type of rider, so you haven't got a really high peak power, then 40-20s is probably not the session for you. That kind of rider is more suited to 1 and 2 minute efforts and lots of those as well. So with this kind of session, it is a very good session and well structured. But I would just have a look at what kind of rider you are and how suitable it is to your characteristics.
Got you. So if you're the more steady state, slow twitch fiber type person, you're going to really struggle with this session. But that's, I guess, not to say you shouldn't try, give it a good go, and it's going to be beneficial because it's going to address your weakness. Now, if you're trying to become a faster, more punchy rider, this is still going to be of benefit, right?
Definitely give it a go, but the key point here is that what we used to do with people that had a really low, we call it Pmax. So if you go out and do a maximal 3 to 5 second sprint and your max power isn't overly high, you have what we call a low Pmax. And what we used to do to alleviate that was we would throw a whole lot of high intensity efforts under 30 seconds at those kind of riders in the hope of improving that. But fast twitch fibers respond to high intensity work. Slow twitch fibers don't respond to that kind of work. So if you don't have a high Pmax, doing tons of high intensity short efforts isn't going to improve your top end power. That's where that kind of rider is more suited to doing a real lot of those 1 and 2 minute sort of maximal efforts with short recovery. So again, definitely try a session. Yeah, I'm just trying to make the point that it's suited to a particular type of rider.
Good stuff. All right, Kev, you're next up on the next bit as well, cycling terminology. So 30 seconds, Kev, and I'm going to give you a term. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Good man. Okay, mate, you've got 30 seconds to describe the term granny gear.
Granny gear. Okay, immediately it makes me think of you when you're out riding there. So this is when you're riding the smallest gear you have, sometimes associated with mountain bike riding because we have a really small gear. So it's when you have an unusually small gear. So if you're out on a road bike, it could be when you're in your 39-28 or a compact chainring of 36 and 34 in the back. So on a steep climb, you have to go to your smallest gear. And the reason why granny gear.
Granny gear.
Mat
Got it. Mat row granny gear.
Basically, your granny can turn the gear over. It's that small.
Bang. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And I would say nothing wrong with the granny gear. I mean, when you're going up a steep climb, we're all very grateful of that granny gear. And it's always it's a macho thing, I guess, to be 39-23. It's kind of like standard. But when you're going up a real steep climb, if you're at a 34-28, that's going to be a good thing for most of us.
Yeah, well, the range of gears on bikes these days has expanded massively. It was only 5 years ago we only had or more 39-28. Now we have compact chain rings and bigger cogs on the back, and that smaller gear is there. And I guess in some ways it was shunned upon to use that smaller gear, but if it's there, save the legs and use it for sure.
Absolutely. Spin to win, what a wise man once told me. All right, Kev, quick fire then, mate. Slightly different, rather than kind of a question, I've got a fill in the blank. So fill in the blank after this short statement. If it's raining, ...
Zwift. Easy. Of course.
I was going to say, if it's raining, don't go training. But yeah, that's another option. But yeah, I guess in the UK and countries where it rains a lot, it's kind of, you've got to suck it up. I mean, I live close enough to a velodrome, and obviously Zwift, fantastic. And go to the gym. But a lot of people, yeah, what for you, if it was rain, I guess you wouldn't even entertain riding outside with Australia, good weather?
There's no need to ride in the rain. I guess I don't race anymore, obviously, but for the racing cyclists, yeah, you need to get used to the conditions and so on. But if you're getting back-to-back days of rain, maybe do one day in the rain and then get the effective training indoors on Zwift for sure. There's
an article which explored the cost of riding in sunny weather versus wet weather. And everything just wears out quicker. You have to get back and clean your bike. You've got all your clothes are stinking. You have to put them on a hot wash. Brake pads are obviously going to wear out a lot quicker in the rain. There's more grit in your chain, all that. And it's all small comments, but it's quite an interesting point that the article is making. It's basically riding in the rain is more expensive than riding in the dry.
Oh, there you go. Ride on Zwift, save money.
Exactly. And again, come back to, we've said it over and over, the magic formula is indoors and Zwift, isn't it? They obviously complement each other. Yeah, so get a bit of both in for the magic mix. All right, Q&As, and we've got a home, as I mentioned previously, for the podcast. So for the Q&A section, we're taking our questions now from the Zwift forums, the podcast section. So share your comments and questions on there. Our first question is from Dave Albershon. Dave's question reads, "Hi guys, love the podcasts. I'd love to hear a discussion about how important cadence is when training and riding overall. It depends on the goal, I'm sure, but I'm not sure how to incorporate low or high cadence in training. What's the right level and whether it is even critical?" What do you make of it?
Oh, big question. But we do have the science to answer this one. I would start by saying that a watt is not a watt. We used to say when power meters first came out that a watt is a watt. 300 watts is 300 watts no matter how you're producing it. It's not the case. So depending on how fast you're turning the pedals, it's going to determine the amount of torque in the crank. And that's going to then determine the type of muscle fibers that are engaged to produce that power. So in training, we can really go to extremes on both ends in terms of low cadence and high cadence to get an enhanced training effect. In racing, my advice is you're going to ride the cadence that is most comfortable depending on your freshness, fatigue, fuel availability, and so on from there. And going back to the beginning, you're going to notice that when we first start to get into our training blocks, when we come into training in an unfit state, you're generally going to notice that your cadence is quite laboured out on the road. It's a bit lower than what it normally is. And you'll find that naturally as you increase fitness, your cadence naturally increases as well, because you become more supple in your pedaling stroke as well. So without going into any specific training, there is a change in your cadence as well, because as you increase your aerobic fitness, you're going to increase your cadence, which makes your training more aerobic as well. But in terms of training, we do go to both ends in an extreme way to enhance the training effect. The classic training session is strength endurance, or we refer to them as SEs, formed on climbs, low gears, high power, high crank torque. And the theory behind that is that when we increase the crank torque, we're engaging our fast twitch fibers, and these fast twitch fibers, they don't get trained that often. So to engage fast twitch fibers and to get a good amount of volume into them, we can do strength endurance efforts ranging from 5 minutes even up to the pros do 40-minute efforts on long climbs at an RPM of 40, and generally it's just under threshold power as well. So my advice for the listeners to try strength endurance efforts would be to start at a cadence of around 60 and a power of about 80% of your threshold. And as you get used to it, you can then decrease the cadence and you can increase the power up to around threshold level as well. The other extreme, and I actually had a rider doing this today in Austria, coincidentally, is doing high power efforts. And the challenge is, so we do them over, say, a 3-minute effort at threshold power. The challenge is to, during the 3 minutes, decrease the gear, so go to a smaller gear and go to the highest cadence that you can to produce the target power. And you end up spinning very uncomfortably, and that's where the training effect comes into it. And it makes it a really aerobic effort at threshold power as well. So it's another example at the other end of the spectrum of placing the body under stress to get the training effect. So try doing threshold efforts over a duration of 3 to 5 minutes. Start out at your normal cadence at the target power threshold, and over the course of the effort, go to a smaller gear, increase the cadence so you're spinning quite high, and see what cadence you can get to hold that power as well.
Nice one. I like the idea of that the high cadence effort, and I guess for listeners, the cadence you get to is going to vary drastically amongst you. But what again, your pro in Austria, Kev, what kind of cadence would he be hitting for those couple of minutes?
Yeah, to put some numbers on it, the gradient was 9%, so it's quite steep.
Yeah.
The power in this instance was 500 watts, and the cadence was 100 for 3 minutes. So it was, and we did it 6 times. It was a really good session, and yeah, it was coincidentally that this question came up today because we had that session today. But it is like we sometimes concentrate on the lower end, the high crank torque. This is going the other end where you really make it a really aerobic effort at high power, and to repeat it at the same cadence, that's where the training effect is. So the key point is just go to the highest cadence that you can. You'll be really spinning, you'll be down in that small gear on a climb. You should be at least 80 revs on a climb, if not getting up to 100 on a climb during that effort.
Yeah, good one. Just had a look as well. Our podcast number 3 was all about cadence, and going back, I know the audio quality wasn't quite what it is now, but there is a podcast that we've done about a year ago actually, talking all about cadence. So if you fancy listening a little bit more about that, then check out the third podcast. Second question then, this is from Ruben Crandonk via the Zwift forums. I'm actually going to paraphrase this question as Ruben goes into quite a bit of detail. And it's all on the Zwift forums if you want to read up on it. Paraphrased version reads, I have a high FTP, racing ACAT on Zwift, so figured my Zwift performances would suggest I would do quite well in real life local racing, but I'm really struggling outdoors. I profiled myself across my sprint, my 1 minute, 5 minute and my threshold, so know where my weaknesses lie, and it's basically my top end. So that, coupled with my lack of race experience and limited confidence, I struggle racing outdoors. Any advice? So yeah, it's I guess the nature of Zwift racing is that you spend a lot of time, especially if you're in large groups, riding around threshold, around zone 4. So around the power, you're naturally very good at, Ruben. What this does then is just further trains and develops your strength and neglecting your weakness. So kick your performance on in Zwift and in real life. So just to make you an all-round better bike rider, you really need to start engaging just training your top end. So some sprinting, some VO2 max efforts. And the main thing I would advocate here is just do some kind of capacity efforts. So don't get too rigid with it. You can use in-game some of the sprints, the 200 and 300 meter sprints. You can use a climb to try and get from A to B as quick as possible. And that could mean, if it's kind of a lap, or even a lap of the volcano circuit, whatever it may be, as long as you're doing efforts that kind of from 30 seconds up to 5 minutes or so, that's really going to focus in and train your weakness. And that should then translate to a better performance across the shorter power durations, of course, but also in racing. And coupled with, you need to get some race experience and group riding. So get outside, find a group, ride in bunches as much as possible, and practice makes perfect. And it won't come overnight. It will take a bit of time, no doubt. And this is a great example where Zwifting and riding outdoors complement each other perfectly. Get your specific efforts done indoors on Zwift, then get your racecraft and your group riding done, obviously out with other groups. So yes, I hope that helps, Ruben. Question 3 is from Z. Croyder, and Z's question reads, I have an event in early September and again later in the month. What should I do in the 3 weeks in between to maintain top form without pressing too hard and getting into a decline phase? This is a tricky one, and I guess for this one, Kev, we can only assume that Z's gonna hit his first event in peak form. So let's assume the question is, how do I maintain that form for 3 weeks?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like you say, let's assume that this is their A race and they've hit their peak form early September, and this is their key month of racing. My suggestion here is to just decrease the volume a little bit and maintain some intensity during that period. So keep touching on the top end stuff because you've already got the endurance, you've got the volume behind you. Keep consistent in your training, but just reduce the volume and keep 1 or 2 key high intensity sessions each week just to maintain that top end, and you'll have no problem maintaining top form for 4 weeks.
Yeah, I completely agree. I guess the trick is not to get too carried away and try and train too hard, because you get into a state of fatigue in that 3 weeks. You sort of dig yourself a hole. You've got to try and get out of it. So if you've got good form, as Kev said, just tick along and just look forward to your final event. But either way, Z, good luck with it.
I would just, add to that, Matt, I didn't mention before, do quality efforts with quality recovery. So we don't want to go into deep fatigue. So good efforts, good recovery as well, just to maintain that form.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the form's there, isn't it? So you've just produced a huge effort in your target event. So now this is where that's a huge training hit out as well. So give your body plenty of chance to recover after your first goal, the start of September. And no, don't be afraid to take 3, 4, 5 days rest if needed, because you have got 3 weeks to kind of build back up and kind of and train and then freshen up for your second target event. So, yeah, hope some of that helps, Z. Cool. All right, Kev, good to chat, mate. And listeners, I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Josh. And yeah, we'll catch you on the next podcast.
Excellent, great. Thanks, Matt, and very interesting with Josh. And thanks for the questions, listeners.